Hello, my name is David Johnson. I have been asked to give a short introduction to this ocean governance webinar session. I tend to use ocean governance and ocean policy terms synonymously, but of course, it's organizations and their policies working to legal requirements or legal mandates that determines ocean governance. This is my CV in pictures. I've been involved with the oceans for a long while now, but particularly looking at intertidal wetlands and the relative sea level rise implications for salt marshes, water quality and pollution, shipping impacts. As Executive Secretary of the OSPAR Commission, which was a regional seas convention for the Northeast Atlantic, and often with projects working in the third world, like this picture in the bottom right, which shows a fishing village in Senegal. This is my company, Seascape Consultants, and it's rather a crowded slide, but it gives an indication of a whole number of ocean governance projects that we've been involved with, working with biodiversity, working with data, working with the International Seabed Authority, working with a number of EU projects and collaborating with different institutions. And one of the reasons I put this slide up is that in the ocean governance and ocean policy world, one of the things we're very guilty of is using acronyms all the time. And it makes it even more confusing. But the International Seabed Authority, the ISA, for example, is quite a mouthful, and the Regional Environmental Management Plan for deep sea mining, the REMP, is even more complicated. So people working in ocean governance and ocean policy tend to use acronyms a lot. One of the things that got me inspired in this line of work in 1972 was this image of the Earth. It's this iconic blue marble image, which shows how much of the planet is ocean. And I think these messages are quite fundamental, and I'll go on to talk about that a bit later. And images can be very powerful. This image is another example. It shows the number of humans killed by sharks in little icons, but a vast layer of red showing sharks killed by humans. So is science to policy an issue for the ocean? Well, yes, it is. We talk a lot about integrated ocean governance and best available science and using the precautionary principle. But ocean governance is a combination, really, of science, engineering, law, often international law, and politics. And all these different disciplines come together, making life quite complicated. And those disciplines and the people working in the ocean policy and ocean governance world use different languages, different approaches, and importantly, different timescales. So we have a range of challenges in all of that, and a different hierarchy of different organizations using those different aspects. There are also equity disparities, so a strong north-south divide, different rights and obligations, and then issues to do with capacity building and technology transfer needs that make ocean governance really something of a dark art. So policymakers and those working with ocean governance are driven by obligations. And what sort of things does that mean? Well, both existing and future obligations. So existing obligations can be laws that have been signed up to by an organization, but looking ahead, there are future obligations related to different pressures. And then there's a hard law. Hard law is compulsory, quite often directives or decisions. And there's soft law, which can be voluntary, which is quite often recommendations. And different organizations operate in different ways. So the European Commission, for example, often has framework directives. These are legally binding, but they allow each country to interpret the directive and have its own national law that works towards that framework directive. The level of ambition is also important. Some policymakers have high ambition to achieve a certain outcome, and others have a lower ambition, and there needs to be a meeting of those different ambitions when you get into a scale that's perhaps global or regional. And resource availability is hugely important in all of this as well. If you're governing an area, you need to be able to enforce and monitor that governance, and work towards any regulations that have been put in place. What triggers action? Well, a variety of things. Sometimes shock. Sometimes a shock at an incident or an accident, for example. Quite often proof, that the mounting evidence that the situation requires action and governance, or sometimes and increasingly altruism or ethics. These things ought to be done. It's right for them to be done. And face-to-face meetings in the ocean governance world are really important. So these comprise committees or working groups or intersessional correspondence groups, or meetings of contracting parties to a convention. So whereas virtual meetings are good for disseminating information, and COVID has made the technology for virtual meetings much stronger, face-to-face meetings allow for powerful conversations leading to action and change. And that can often result in better or good decisions and more organizational agility. So the COVID period was quite difficult for the policy world and the governance world. Many things stalled, many things couldn't be signed off, and we're catching up at the moment with many marine agendas. There's an added value as well in face-to-face meetings, because there's a chance perhaps to think out of the box, ahead of the market, and innovate in a way that is good for governance. So in terms of informing multilateral environmental agreements, I've just shown on this slide there are different ways of doing that, and with time those ways can become stronger. So personal contact at meetings, which we've just been talking about, is important. Information to support that is important as well, but ultimately it's important to get issues onto the agenda of policymakers, and that can be done by a contracting party, a national government, an observer to a convention, or the secretariat. So those different entities are really important in terms of getting an item onto the agenda, and then there's a business of gathering support and finally taking action. So achieving more societal relevance, which is key to ocean governance, is about presenting the right information in a way that policymakers can digest and getting the timing right. And while I work in biodiversity most of my time, this is quite common to other areas as well, such as climate change. So a couple of quotes here from the climate world, from the IPCC, and from a BBC report, really emphasizing that policy making shouldn't be overly prescriptive, and often messaging is really, really important. So what do policymakers need from science? Here's a bullet point list. Careful monitoring and accurate assessment are important. Practical indicators, robust evidence, spatially explicit predictive models, credible, relevant, legitimate evidence. That should really be peer-reviewed. A balanced overview, clear messages, confidence in the information that's being imparted, things that are policy relevant, and links to socioeconomics and identification of knowledge gaps. So just a couple of examples. We do quite a lot of work for the Convention on Biological Diversity, and here's just a slide of the sort of things that their marine division is involved with: plastics and debris, coral reefs, marine spatial planning, area-based conservation, sustainable fishing, deep sea mining, underwater noise, and then interaction with regional organizations and EBSAs, ecologically or biologically significant marine areas, which are special places in the world's ocean. And in the governance world, last December, there was a big conference of the parties, COP15 of the CBD, and at that COP, they decided a new set, a global framework of biodiversity framework of targets and monitoring to drive biodiversity conservation for the next 10 years. So a response, a policy response, a governance response to the climate, ocean, biodiversity nexus was made at this particular meeting of the Conference of the Parties. And then finally, something which is very much now on our horizon, which adds to this mishmash of high seas governance. We've been talking about the CBD on the far left, which feeds into UNEP, which is all driven by the United Nations General Assembly, and the high seas governance arm is also beholden to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is the legal framework that binds all these bodies. And what was agreed earlier this year is a new international legally binding treaty for biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, for its conservation and sustainable use. And I'm sure perhaps in the webinar, others will talk about that. So thank you very much. I hope that gives a quick introduction. And I know that others who are on this session, on this call, will be able to answer questions if you have them. Thank you for listening to me.